I'm ready.
It's a pleasure to introduce Kingsley Madueke for our speaker today. Kingsley is an Urban Studies Foundation International Research Fellow at the Department of Urban Planning and Public Policy here at Irvine. He received his PhD from the University of Amsterdam, and he has also a master's from the University of Jos in Nigeria, about which his talk is about. His talk is about that. He will talk to us about killer mobs in deadly ethnic riots, lessons from walking in the footsteps of fighters in Jos, Nigeria. So, Kingsley, you have the floor, and we can start.
Thank you very much, Stergios. I'm very, very happy and excited to take the next few moments to share what I've been doing in over the last 5-6 years, particularly on deadly riots in central Nigeria. So quickly, he has already introduced me, so I will just quickly give a background of violent conflict in Jos, which I will do very quickly before I now go into the details of the presentation, which is actually the dynamics, the intergroup dynamics of armed mobs in deadly riots. So, just a few highlights. I'm going to start with a background to the conflict in Jos, Nigeria, and then I'll provide maybe some key perspectives on the violence from the existing literature, and then point out some puzzlements, blind spots, and questions, and then go on to speak about the mobilization and spatial movements of armed mobs. And then by way of this presentation, introduce a conceptual idea that I'm still developing now, which I'll very much appreciate feedback on, which is the idea of competitive fanaticism. That's competitive fanaticism. And then I'll also speak on the spatial movements and group entrainment in armed mobs. And finally, I'll give a recap of the findings from my study and then some concluding reflections. So that with that out of the way, so Jos is a city located in central Nigeria. It is the capital city of Plateau State. Plateau State is one of the 36 states in which Nigeria is divided into. So Plateau State is one of the 36 federating units, and Jos is the capital city of Plateau State. It's located in central Nigeria. And recently, to be precise, from 2001 until recently, the city has been engulfed by persistent episodes of deadly violence between its Christian and Muslim populations. But this violence have the violence is a very recent development from at the turn of the 20th to 21st century, in 2001 to be precise. But the conflict itself has a long history and is rooted in the very circumstances that surrounded the establishment of the city. So the city is a colonial creation, and it was established in 1915. But before the establishment of Jos, the groups there who identify themselves as the indigenous groups were in touch and had trading links with predominantly Muslim groups from northern Nigeria, especially the Hausa. And some of these encounters were quite cooperative. They engage in trade, they engage in other business activities, but there was a jihad sometime in the mid-19th century. The jihad actually, the Hausa people of northern Nigeria were co-opted into the jihadist forces. And the jihadist forces attempted to invade what would later become the city of Jos. And the indigents there, who were predominantly pagan, resisted the jihadists. And so this actually was the first instance of conflict between the indigents and the predominantly Hausa Muslims from northern Nigeria.
Kingsley,
yeah.
Kingsley, excuse me.
Yes.
You're moving down on my screen. I see an empty sort of part of your PowerPoint. Down your PowerPoint or?
Oh, you cannot see my PowerPoint?
Well, yeah, I can see it, but there's nothing in it. Do you have your slideshow? Did you put it on a slideshow?
It's on slideshow.
You'll need to share your slideshow. You're sharing the actual presentation instead, so it's just stuck on page 2.
Okay. Yeah, I'm actually on page 2.
Oh, you're on page 2, but you don't have, which is empty.
Okay, it's empty. Then something is wrong.
Okay, I unshared. You try resharing it again, Kingsley, and
okay, let me
try and share the actual the slideshow itself.
Okay. Okay, I understand where. Can you see it now? Hello?
Yes, you can see it now. Stergios, you're muted right now.
Can you see it?
Yeah, we can see it. Not the slideshow, but the slide, the way you see it when you prepare it. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, okay. Because, so now if I switch to slideshow, just confirm to me. Do you see it?
No, actually, I don't.
Okay.
That's strange.
That's quite strange.
Well, we can do it without the slideshow necessarily if you move through the slides yourself.
Can you see it now?
I see the first page of the, not the slideshow, but the actual sort of thing, which is okay as long as you move it along, yeah. But this is
okay, because I'm seeing the slideshow. That's what I'm seeing. This is my first time doing this. I'm very sorry. And
oh, it's okay. When you go to the second page, can you try go to the second page?
yeah, I'm on the second page now.
It doesn't move in the second page, actually. That's strange. Wow. Do you know what might be happening?
Let me share again.
Can you go to number 2 and see?
Number 2?
Yeah. Slide number 2.
Yeah, I'm on slide number 2 now.
I only seen slide number 1. Number 2?
Okay.
If you go
Yeah,
number
so
2
I'm
now.
very sorry.
Yeah,
I'm
now
on
I see
3
number
now.
2. Okay, number 3. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so
Hey,
let me just, I'm
sorry.
so sorry. Let me just go like this, yeah. Yeah, so I mentioned the pre-colonial encounters. Sorry for the disruption. And then, so the colonial administration established a very booming tin mining industry in Jos. And this tin mining industry attracted groups from different parts of the country and outside the country. I'm talking about the British colonial administration. So the British colonial administration established the city in 1915 as a tin mining town. And then, but the local population was not interested in working in the mines. So the colonial administration had to go out of the vicinity to get labor from northern Nigeria. Now remember, these were people that were already in conflict because of the jihad that happened about 50 years prior to this time. So, but the British administration brought these people to work in the tin mines and then brought them, so there were frictions immediately. But then, of course, the colonial administration was able to, was very firm and was able to suppress any kind of, to discourage or prevent any kind of manifest conflict, so to say. But not to really, I mean, not to spend too much time on that, Jos is located, another factor that makes Jos particularly explosive is, you can see from the map, is located in the center, almost in the heart of Nigeria. And the northern part, this side of the map, is northern Nigeria and is predominantly Muslim. This other part, the southern part, is actually predominantly Christian. Now, the middle belt, this gray area here, where Jos is located, is predominantly Christian, but it's made up of what we call ethnic minority groups. These are pockets of small groups. They are predominantly Christian, but then they speak Hausa along with the Muslim part of Nigeria. So there's a kind of tug of war, a territorial struggle for territorial control between even Christian and Muslim groups for Jos, which is located here. And you also have, in the post-independence period, you have series of military rules that really affected group dynamics in Jos, because the federal government, a system of the military government, if the military government is a Hausa from the north, then the government seems to be partisan and advances the interest or protect the interest of the Hausa within Jos. And anytime it's a Christian, so that's how local identities became hyper politicized, such that at a point, ethnic religious boundaries coincided almost perfectly with political boundaries in terms of partisan politics. So you have Christians belonging to a particular political party and Muslims to a so the boundaries hardened and the overlap became very exact at a point. And then we have SAP, which is a structural adjustment program, which also shaped group dynamics in Jos, because SAP actually had a counterproductive effect on economic viability of the entire country. But then because Jos, there were already long-standing conflicts, group dynamics competition was intensified between the rivaling groups, and due to rise of unemployment, poverty levels, scarcity of resources. So this competition became very, very, very acute. This is around the 1980s, mid-80s to 90s. But still, this did not translate into violent conflict. And of course, I mentioned the politicization of ethnic identities. And then in 1999, after about 3 decades of military rule, Nigeria returned to a democratic system of government in May 1999. So what the successive military governments were able to do, they were able to suppress any form of expression of grievances. So at that time, there was a form of graveyard peace. Yes, there were conflicts, there were grievances, but people could not express them in any form. But immediately on the eve of the return to democratic system of governance, there was a spike of, violent conflicts in different parts of the country, but especially within Jos, where grievances have been long suppressed. So, and there's also the issue of indigenous settler dichotomy. So the local groups who are predominantly Christian identify as indigenes and sons of the soil of Jos. And they refer to the Hausas who have been in Jos for the last 100 years. That's from 1915 when the city was established. They refer to them as settlers. And these categories have, they define who has access to particular resources. So indigenes have access to scholarships, they have access to certain employments and appointment into government parastatals that settlers do not have access to. So these categories, these labels are actually tied to access and inaccess to resources. And in 2001, violence broke out in Jos. So through this presentation, I'll present some ideas to explain why, even though the conflict has always been there, it is in 2001 that we saw it come to manifestation in terms of, we saw a violent dimension of the conflict. So, okay. So between 2001 and last year, that's 2019, just witnessed several episodes of violent clashes. But the notable ones happened in September 2001, where about over 1,000, some people estimate, the figures are contested, but there are estimates that estimate within 6 days of fighting, about 3,000 people were killed. But conservative estimates put it at 1,000. In 2008, November, between November and December, another violent riot erupted in which about 700 people were killed within the span of 2 days. And that's in end of November and beginning of December 2008. And then in January 17th, 2010, another riot erupted in which several hundred people were killed. And this time the problem was actually made more complicated because in the December of that year, Boko Haram actually launched a bombing, series of bombings in Jos, actually 3 explosions on the eve of Christmas of 2010. It was the first time that the city officially recorded a bomb explosion. And then these riots went on in 2011 and 2015. And then the last one happened in 2019, in which unfortunately I was almost a victim in 2019. Cumulatively, within Jos and the surrounding areas, figures are highly contested, they are politicized, but there's a consensus that about 9,000 people could have died in the year from 2001 up to 2019, and over 500,000 internally displaced persons, and of course, tens of thousands of homes, offices, vehicles destroyed. So there's been a lot of literature, discussions on the conflict in Jos, but most of these discussions have been basically from a structural point of view in terms of looking at how poverty, how unemployment, how weak institutions have contributed to foiling this conflict. And but so the literature is, there's a significant body of work on Jos actually right now that discusses these ideas in a very succinct, in a very insightful way. But then it leaves out, it still leaves us with a lot of blind spots and puzzlements, like any other structural explanation. To this day, we do not know the factors that shape sub-city variations in the occurrence and spread of ethnic violence. For example, it is very unclear why some poor neighborhoods experience violence and others do not. It is very, very unclear. There's no clear, because the structural factors are constant across Jos and even constant across most parts of Nigeria. Poverty is a big problem. But then why is violence concentrated in particular locales and not others? That question remains. And structural explanations of the conflict have not been able to explain this. And another blind spot is, though we know the prevailing conditions, we know that fueled conflict in Jos. We even know the triggers, we know the immediate, the remote and proximate causes, but we do not have in any specific sense, any concrete way, we do not know how intergroup tensions translated into violence in Jos. Like, what are the processes that translates these tensions to violent clashes? We do understand the conditions, but a process-based approach that explains in very concrete terms how they translate into violent clashes is very much needed. And then thirdly, we do know, I mean, it's in India, Delhi, in Meerut, in Ahmedabad, here in Nigeria, in Abuja, in Jos, in Kaduna, you go to Nairobi, I mean, even in London, in the US cities, we know that riots are committed. Violence is mostly perpetrated by armed mobs. We know there's large group of men, mostly men, but of course with some women in some cases. But we do not know very well how individuals suddenly form into these mobs. We do not know how they leave their homes, the routes they use, and just the micro level dynamics of how mobs come about and how they go about perpetrating violence on Jos, in relation to Jos. We know very little about that. And then fourth and finally, we know that fighters have a way of eluding security forces, that even after deployment of peacekeeping forces, violence still goes on, sometimes right under the nose of security forces. And security forces, they describe the violence sometimes as intractable. So why is this? Why are these armed mobs very elusive? That's another concern. And these blind spots, maybe they will have a bias because of my background in conflict management and because I've been part of several peace building measures in JOS. And these are some of the concerns that I usually observe as part of those peace building processes. So what methods have I used? I mean, from this, I'm sure it comes to mind directly that one of the ways to look at this is through an ethnographic fieldwork, which affords the opportunity for really spending time with key actors and spending a lot of time in communities that have experienced violence, and even those that have somehow not experienced relative levels of violence. So I found an ethnographic fieldwork approach very apt and suitable. And because I used mobile interviews, since one of my objectives is to map the spatial movements of armed mobs. So one of the things I did was I conducted about 22 of such mobile interviews, covering about roughly 100 kilometers in walking distance over the span of several months, and about 100 hours of open-ended discussions during the interviews. And in addition to that, I had regular interviews and ground truthing discussions with riot participants, victims of violence, local politicians, security agents, and cross-section of residents. And then what sets this apart is it may be the first time in JOS that someone is doing participant observation with people that actually were part of the violence. And I'm very lucky to have this access because I did a lot of peace building work. And apart from that, at the beginning of the riots in JOS, I was caught up in it personally. So doing participant observation came in quite handy. So I also rely on archival materials, and a lot of them from the Nigerian Archive Center in Kaduna. And so my key objectives, I have several objectives, but I think 3 are worth mentioning. So the first is to identify key actors and their roles in the production of violence in JOS's deadly riots. The second is to illustrate how individuals formed into armed mobs by identifying fighters' origin, their routes, and destinations of violence. And then thirdly and finally, to unearth intra-group micro-level processes and practices that shaped the transition from tensions to deadly riots. Stergios, is everything okay?
Yes, it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can allow for clarifying questions. We'll have questions.
Okay.
But
yeah.
If people are free to ask clarifying questions, so you get some input too. Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So any point at which you think I'm moving too fast or you need to clarify, please feel free to stop me, because I'm just focusing on this slide. So can I go on?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's say we have another until 1:30 until then, if you can speak for that or earlier so that we can give some time.
Okay.
Afterwards.
Okay, so I'll stop. Definitely I'll stop by then. Talking about the actors, like I mentioned earlier, I mean, the literature, there's a significant consensus on the role of armed mobs in this kind of deadly riots. Anywhere it happens, we know that the people that perpetrate the violence are assemblages of people that just come together almost like suddenly and perpetrate this violence and then disappear after the violence. And but we that's all we know about them. We do not know how they come together. We do not know how these individuals leave their homes, how they hear about it, where they congregate, where they decide, how they decide their targets. We know very little about that, or we take it for granted. And so in Jos, actually, armed mobs have been at the center of violence. And as you can see in the picture, and so they have, in my interviews with hundreds of participants of these riots and my extensive participant observation, I put their number usually roughly ranges from 20 to 200 of armed mobs. That's in Jos. Of course, in other places you can have smaller or larger armed mobs. The age range of the individuals usually range from 15 to 40 years. And then sex, they are mostly male, and but in some cases you have female. And there's a strong how gender and religion now interact, because in Jos's Christian neighborhoods, you are likely to find female participants in riots. Whereas in the Muslim communities, where women live within closed homes, you hardly find women participating in the riots. So there's a way gender and religion interact and actors in the violence. The job profile is many of the actors, some of them are artisans, some of them are actually civil servants. You have traders, you have black marketers, people that sell black market fuel. You have criminals, actually, but not all of them are criminals. You have very respected civil servants who are part of it. You have people who the communities call political thugs. You have drug dealers, and you also have local politicians, people I should have mentioned here. So usually the armed mob are almost like a reflection or a microcosm representation of the community in which they live. So there's the literature, I think before now, has a way of defining the actors in deadly violence, like they are layabouts or they are all criminals. But in fact, from my own experience in Jos, you have very people who on regular days are looked at as very responsible people, and they are still key actors in the violence. So the weapons used, they use firearms, they use machetes, they use cutlasses, knives, Molotov bombs, spears, bows and arrows, swords. One of the things is the armed mob are usually made up of people that share the same religion in the case of Jos. So usually they are either Christian or Muslim. So these are some of my working experiences in the routes used by the armed mobs. So like I mentioned in the method section is basically what I did was to conduct this series of mobile interviews where people that participated in the riots will take me from how they left their homes or wherever they were to where they joined the crowds and where they first encountered violence and how they retreated and came back. So I was doing that. I wanted to know their gathering points. I wanted to know in each community, where did they meet and how did they decide their targets? And so I worked with these people, and it actually yielded some very interesting insights. So for example, this is a representation. This gives a rough idea of ethnic segregation and diversity in Jos. And what this map tries to convey is, you can see the darkest parts are Muslim neighborhoods, then the lighter one are Christian neighborhoods, then the intermediate is mixed neighborhoods. So what we have, what I first noticed, what was very glaring, after noticing that these individuals that formed armed mobs usually keep away from the main roads. They have a strong preference for back alleys, very narrow alleys, like seen in this picture. Alleys that vehicles cannot go through. And they do that for the obvious reasons to keep away from patrolling security forces. But they're very, very, so the more a neighborhood has this kind of back alleys, I find out the more it is susceptible to the activities of armed mobs. So that was one of the immediate thing that came to my notice. But the second thing was how demography interacted with how the spatial movements of the armed mobs interacted with the demographic characteristics of the neighborhoods. So neighborhoods, armed mobs mostly congregated they congregated mostly in segregated neighborhoods. But then they don't partake in violence within those segregated neighborhoods. They march, sometimes they walk or run for 1 or 2 kilometers to where they will engage in violence. And mostly where they engage in violence are ethnically mixed areas that are located between rivaling segregated neighborhoods. So what they do is they march from these segregated areas and clash with another group, a rival group who has marched from another segregated area. And if this ethnically mixed neighborhood is linked to the segregated one through contiguous back alleys, these narrow back alleys that are identified, then you're more likely to witness violence in those kind of areas. But those ethnically neighborhoods that are separated by clear tarmac roads or highways or some physical boundaries, they tend to witness fewer incidents of riots. So I found out also that in terms of mobilization, so in the segregated neighborhoods, youth leaders are very prominent in disseminating information. And you find out that the residents come out en masse. They're able to navigate and come and meet at a central point. So it's very easy to mobilize crowds in segregated settlements. But the situation is different. In the mixed settlements, residents are afraid of going out because they will tell you they are not sure what awaits them at the turn of the street. They may meet somebody that belongs to the enemy group. So mostly residents in those areas keep to their immediate vicinity, and they are not able to congregate into large armed mobs. And because they are not able to congregate into large groups, they are unable also to defend their communities against invading forces from the segregated areas. So this has a way of making them far more susceptible to violence than neighborhoods that are not sandwiched between these ethnically segregated areas. And these are some of, based on the interviews, this graphic tries to show the direction of movements from segregated areas to the ethnically mixed area. Like this area here is happens to be one of the most violent parts of Jos. It's known as Nasara Lagoon. So Nasara Lagoon has Angon Rukuba, where it's predominantly Christian, and then to the other side is Bauchi Road, which is predominantly Muslim. And you have large armed mobs of up to 200 people marching from these areas into this ethnically segregated area. So it is one of the areas that has witnessed the most recurrent violent conflict, episodes of violence in Jos. So I mentioned that, movements in mixed neighborhoods. Why armed mobs cannot mobilize in mixed neighborhoods? Obviously, because not too many people can leave their homes because of the fear that they may be attacked just at the turn of the street. They don't know what is happening next door because the next door neighbor may be a Christian, or on the next street are Christian homes, on another street are Muslims. So people are scared of really moving and congregating. So I'll just jump and so this is also a graphic representation. I tried to plot the mobile interviews on a Google map of Jos. This is Jos city center. And what you have here, the black spots are where people meet other peers and then march towards. The red points are places of violence. And these are also directions of movements from different communities. So you have violence. This is an ethnically mixed area. All these places that you see, there's a lot of violence, are ethnically mixed areas. And then the green dots represents the patrols by security forces. And you can see that most of the armed mobs move in directions that they hardly have to encounter security forces. So I'm still trying to develop this into a higher resolution graphic presentation. So, but this is just to give you a rough idea of what I'm talking about. So, sites of, like I mentioned, armed mobs are more easily mobilized in ethnically segregated areas, yet they need a battleground to engage in violence. An adjoining ethnically mixed settlement, especially if it shares its part of its boundaries with another segregated settlement inhabited by a rival group, provides an apt frontier for confrontation. So I suggest that such mixed areas lack the cohesiveness to mobilize against external forces. Even when they organize joint patrols to keep troublemakers, like the case is, such efforts prove futile in the face of escalating violence and determined external armed groups. So this is another graphic showing you how I mapped these movements. So that's about tracking the spatial movements of violent groups. The next minutes, I want to use it to just describe two dynamics that have to do directly with the intragroup processes of armed mobs in Jos. So for want of a better term, I want to start with the term competitive fanaticism. And I describe this term because I noticed it in Jos, and I'm still developing it, and I particularly appreciate feedback on it. So it's competitive fanaticism refers to a state of affairs where individuals within armed mobs, that's individuals that belong to the same armed mob are locked in competition and perpetually trying to outperform each other in their demonstration of loyalty to the group, zeal and competence in protecting its interest, and hate towards avowed enemies. So fighters are pushed towards violent actions, not only by the need to hurt members of the rival group, but also by the desire to prove their commitment and loyalty to the in-group. Commitment to the in-group is measured in terms of the extent of destruction one is willing and able to inflict on the members of the out-group. So the more killings, injuries, deaths, or destruction one is able to inflict on the enemies or their property, the more committed one is considered to be. So this commitment, of course, is rewarded with monetary gifts, prestige, or upward social mobility within the group rank. And I'll just explain this. So this is competitive fanaticism is an idea that it was in the depths of my ethnographic work that it became very, very clear. It was a pervasive reality among the groups. When I'm working with them, I noticed there was a sense of competition among these young men to prove their loyalty to their groups, to the groups they belong to. So it's so pervasive because it happens actually like the people that perpetrate this violence actually occupy the lowest rung of the patronage hierarchy, with politicians at the top. But what happens here between these layabouts, criminals, and ordinary residents is they are competing to show that they are more committed to group goals and protecting the group interest than their peers, because they believe in demonstrating their commitment, they will be rewarded with an upward social mobility. So they can move from one rank to the other. They can move from just ordinary criminals and become campaign foot soldiers for politicians. In some cases, they can even move up to become campaign coordinators. In fact, we've had people that have so much yes?
Just a clarifying question. You have
Yes.
the groups are not pre-existing, but they congregate somehow around politicians. Is that what you are finding?
Yes, so these groups are quotidian or just very informal social networks within the communities. So, but because of pre-existing, of course, social patronage, there's always been patronage systems in Nigeria, but then patronage system assumed a very strong ethnic logic because of the politicization of social networks. So an ethnic logic became very salient in the structure and hierarchy of this patronage systems. And then the logic goes that, look, if the more you are able to contribute to advancing the interest of this ethnic group through electoral politics or through violence, the more you're recognized, you gain a new prestige. And in fact, you can even run for an office if you're considered a very loyal and committed. So there's this struggle now to be as fanatic or to be more fanatic about group goals than your peers. Not because you hate, not really simply because you disparage the enemy group, the so-called enemy, but more so that you can prove your loyalty. So it wasn't, the point then is that to understand these forms of violence, we need to consider such intergroup processes as much as we consider intergroup processes. But the literature, the conventional wisdom has always pointed us towards intergroup dynamics to explain these forms of violence. But this little contribution about competitive fanaticism is to show that these intergroup processes also contribute to the escalation of violence, and somehow they interact with existing patronage systems. And I take the liberty of really explaining it in very detailed form in the book manuscript I'm working on now. So I just to explain it some more, I just say the resort to violence is generally in the dominant literature, is generally understood to be driven by intergroup dynamics such as fear, hate, frustration towards the outgroup. The notion of competitive fanaticism suggests that it is also motivated by the quest to prove to members of the in-group that one is loyal and competent and worthy of respect, prestige, and high status position within the group. I also, this idea is still being developed, which is how armed mobs develop group entrainment, or how they develop synergy or shared emotional energy during violence. And like this picture shows, you can see armed mobs, an armed mob in motion. They are running to a target. Now, it's usually if you witness deadly riots, they are usually very chaotic incidents. They seem very chaotic. But one thing that you will never mistake, one thing that becomes very obvious to an observer, is the single-mindedness with which these groups engage in violence. It's almost like the targets, they are very clear about their targets, they are very direct, and they are ruthless. So of course, to be clear, not every member of the armed mob engage in violence. They are being led by, there are different groups, factions in the armed mob. There are leaders of violence, there are followers, there are those that are just passive. There are even those that just stand by the line and cheer them on. But the thing is, there's a single-mindedness about them, and I'm suggesting that it could be that, I'm still developing this idea, that in running from point A to point B, the motion and the interactions, micro-level interactions that the individuals engage in as they move towards the target, helps them to develop this sense of entrainment and shared emotional energy that now facilitates how they are able to engage in ruthless violence. So, but that idea is I'm still trying to develop it. Yeah, so I think I've made this point, so I'll just jump the slide. And so I'll just end it here on this slide. So some of the practical insights, especially I come from the background of conflict management. So it's to provide violence prevention agents and authorities with practical insights on how to mitigate armed mobs. For example, pre-knowledge of rioters' preferred routes and likely to target neighborhoods can encourage more proactive responses, thus containing fighters before large-scale violence breaks out. Secondly, another practical relevance is it provides insights on the processes and conditions under which individuals become armed mobs, their preferred routes, and the areas where violence is likeliest to occur. And thirdly, highlighting the key roles of residents and youth association leaders in information sharing and mobilization in segregated settlements can give authorities clues concerning whom to focus on and work with to prevent violence. And then finally, understanding competitive fanaticism can help peace-building agents to pay as much attention to intragroup processes as they do intergroup dynamics. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you to Kingsley, trying to clap in any way we can. And
yeah.
So we can start with questions. If you look at your bottom of where it says chat, there are already some questions from Delio Guseitan, from Scott Bollens, and from Faith Bag Samson.
Okay.
So can you see them?
Where can I locate it? Sorry.
Where it says at the bottom, if you scroll down on your app on the screen that we have,
yeah,
and you go and you have chat called chat.
Okay, I see chat. Yeah.
Yeah, and you
absolutely,
go up and you can see the main. There are questions, chats from three, from
yes,
Guseitan, from Scott, and from things. You can read them or respond them without reading them.
So I have from Faith Bag Samson.
Why don't we start the first one? The first one chronologically is at the top.
Okay, I've seen it.
Yeah.
No, I've seen from Dele Ogun Satan. Am I right?
Yeah.
Which is Jos was a major mining town for tin production and became cosmopolitan. What is the main source of employment after the tin industry collapsed? Is unemployment the major driver of riots and violence rather than religious or ethnic differences? Excellent question. So I think I can take them one after the other. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So actually the tin mining, the peak of the tin mining was during the Second World War, when tin was, of course, desperately needed for military hardware in Europe. That was the height of tin mining. But after the Second World War, there was a sharp decline in the demand for tin and iron ore, if you like. Now, the tin mining industry in Jos today is very informal and fragmented. So it does not represent a major employment hub. It is no more. So unemployment, of course, is a big problem in Jos. But like I mentioned, the problem with unemployment explaining conflict is dicey, and the relationship is not so direct, and we have to be very careful, because unemployment is not only a problem in Jos, it's a problem in most parts of Nigeria. But then the question that comes to mind is, well, why is conflict not as constant, violence not as constant and regular as the spread of unemployment? Why is violence concentrated in particular areas? And you can even come at the sub-city level. Why is violence particular to certain poor neighborhoods and not others? So yes, unemployment can be a prevailing condition that creates a conducive environment for competition over scarce resources to thrive. But it does not in any specific sense explain why violence happened. So I hope that in a little way explains it. So there's a question from Scott And are there any mediators or community members in the mixed areas that could lessen playing out of violence? In situations such as Jos, should urbanists, planners, builders, gov seek to encourage more segregation in order to lessen violence and stabilize life? Wow, excellent questions. So are there mediators or community members in the mixed areas? So you have community leaders in Jos over the years have been directly involved in peace building exercises. But in fact, one of the things that actually pushed me or motivated me to take this line of research was I was a recorder or a rapporteur, so to say, for a peace building exercise. And during that exercise, one of the things I noticed was we can have a mediation and reconciliation exercise today. But next week, if violence breaks out in Jos, that same neighborhood will be engulfed in violence. So it became clear it was either our measures were not working or we were not talking to the real people. And what became clear from my walking, my mobile interviewing with fighters, was clearly we were not talking to the people perpetrating the violence. So within these mixed communities, yes, they have their little problems, but the main people that come and engage in the major violence actually come from outside these neighborhoods. So any peace building exercise, any mediation exercise must take cognizance of how these different demographics contribute to violence. The fact that where violence happens does not necessarily translate into the habitation of those that perpetrate violence. So if a neighborhood experiences violence, it doesn't mean that you have the people perpetrating the violence living within that neighborhood. So even if you concentrate mediation exercises within areas that witness violence, you end up not talking to the real people that perpetrate the violence. And then secondly, should urbanists, absolutely, planners, builders. I am not sure if segregation should be encouraged, because I think in the literature it's also clear that segregation may have immediate positive outcome, but in the long term, it can actually solidify stereotypes and encourage and actually help to make endemic some of the narratives that drive the conflict in the first place. So of course, contact theory says that in the right conditions, in the right political conditions, bringing people together can actually go a long way in the long term in encouraging peaceful coexistence. So the point is, but what I've noticed is in cities like Jos, where a large part of the city is informal and there's poor infrastructure, what you can even call infrastructural violence. Like you have these very narrow alleyways that make it very, very easy for perpetrators of violence to disappear and just commit all atrocities and just disappear. They are very elusive because of the informal planning, physical planning of these neighborhoods. And we have seen that there are fewer incidents of violence in neighborhoods that have well laid out street layouts and what have you. So I hope that, yeah.
Yes, Kingsley, if you can hear me, this is Scott Bolins.
Yeah, I can hear you. I can see you too.
Yeah, good. Congratulations on a very strong presentation, and your findings are very clear and very, very important. And a personal note, I hope you're doing okay during this COVID crisis.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, and we have the Faith. He has had the question. towards the
Yeah.
end about, yeah?
Okay. Yeah.
It wasn't really a question so much as just noticing some analogous, I guess, movements on intragroup competition driving certain actions.
Mm-hmm.
So like when Dr. Kingsley is discussing how perhaps the hatred of the outgroup isn't necessarily the only motivating factor in the ultimate like level of violence, and we have to take into consideration intragroup competition, the competitive fanaticism. It strikes me that in some cases where we're wondering why people who before didn't act like they hated somebody now are starting to harden and cement stances against people that maybe instead of looking at prejudices and outgroup, I guess, stereotypes and stuff, we should be also looking at is there an intragroup motivation for having these ideas, and does that better account for some of the things we're seeing in the United States and around the world in too?
Mm-hmm.
Apply to other places?
Yeah. So can I say something?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's interesting. Faith, thank you for that wonderful comment. So in addition to my work in JOS, recently I was part of a project in Northeast Nigeria where you have Boko Haram. And Boko Haram now has splinter factions. And these splinter factions actually emerged as a result of intragroup competitions, interpersonal competitions and differences within group leaders. So Shekau, and there were a couple of individuals that left Shekau to form the group. And discussions with ex-Boko Haram members shows that this same dynamic could have been at play. This competitiveness to show that I am more committed to the group. So in the process, Shekau commits more daring acts and then comes back to tell his followers that look how committed. It is because of my commitment for you and for the group that I'm able to do this. And the other groups too. So it became a competition. Each group trying to be more daring, ever more daring with every incident. And that cumulatively, of course, we know it has an effect on escalation. So I think, like Faith said, it's interesting to see how this plays out with different groups. And I had a discussion with Richard Matthew a couple of weeks ago, and we discussed this. And he also identified it, that it's so interesting, but he could see it, how it plays out even among bike clubs. So motorbike clubs. And he mentioned how they have this interpersonal competitiveness within them, and it cumulatively can affect group dynamics. So it's...
and that's related to the social identity theory, how actually through kind of conflict, you can define, you can further make the group identity more salient. And that's, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question now about sort of the dynamics in the pictures you had about the two groups going into the mixed neighborhood? Is it,
yes,
Is it that's the typical way that you have the two groups essentially simultaneously decide to meet, say, in the neighborhood? Or is it something like you have one group might start and getting towards there and start destroying things or creating sort of things, and then the other group, and you have another that responds to that?
Okay, so I will give you a scenario that can shed light on that. So in 2008, there was what we call chairmanship elections. That's elections into offices for local governments. So you have the local government chairman. So they held elections for chairmanship of JOS. And the two main contending politicians were a Muslim and a Christian. So it was very explosive. Now, there were complications, and at the collation center where they are counting the votes, problems started. And there was a mob outside, and the mob started shouting even before the votes were counted. Now, this was very interesting because it started there, but then soon, and this place was several, I think about 5-6 kilometers away from the city center. But within minutes, we started witnessing violence within the city center, even before those people who actually walked, even before they arrived their neighborhoods. So usually what happens is there are different channels of communication, but especially since the advent of mobile phone, news has been able to be, news diffuses very fast. So what they do is immediately they had, when I investigated how the news traveled, there were a series of phone calls. So Christians were calling their people in their residents, in their neighborhoods, and telling them they should wake up because it happened in the dead of the night. They should wake up, there's problem. The Muslims called their neighborhoods. And when these people woke up, especially the people that were, by the time they woke up, the first thing they wanted to do was to find the next Christian for Muslims, and for Christians to find the next Muslim and attack. Because this is how the atypical phone call sounds. What are you doing still sleeping? Now this is from a live recording. What are you doing still sleeping? They are killing your brothers and sisters and you're sleeping. Wake up and defend yourself. So such phone calls, several of such phone calls were made all around the city. So it was just, it happened so fast, but without talking to the real people that were engaged in the violence, it's even difficult to imagine how did the news travel so fast? How did you just wake up, pick a firearm and just jump out? So they have their meeting points, especially in the segregated areas. They know the routes. They know they have this unbelievably winding paths that if you are not a local, it's difficult for you to even track them. So yeah, and then in the mixed neighborhoods, one of the important things to have in mind is fighting happens at two levels. And so at one level, you find out that the residents of these mixed areas, they fight within themselves, but the fighting is not so intense because what they use usually are domestic objects like kitchen knives and sticks and anything lying about. They just pick it and defend themselves. But the mobs that actually mobilize and come into the neighborhoods, they usually come with far, far more lethal weapons. They come with firearms, they come with Molotov bombs, and while perpetrating violence, the residents of those mixed neighborhoods, each group tries to help its co-ethnics to identify the houses of enemies. So it becomes so complex, but usually the fighting mainly happens at these two levels.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that in a little way sheds.
Yeah, yes. And just one, okay. One more question. We have one more question.
I was just curious if the leaders of Muslim group and the separate leaders of, say, the Christian group, if they ever actually coordinate violence to essentially enhance their powers, like if they actually cooperate occasionally. Obviously, the little foot soldiers aren't, they're killing each other, but I'm just curious if at a higher level there's any cooperation.
Yeah, so of course, when you look at the hierarchy, the group hierarchy, usually at the point where you have local politicians, where it's expedient, you find them walking across religious lines. And it's a beautiful question because that is actually one of the things that peace builders try to call the attention of the foot soldiers to. That look, these people are not actually enemies. When it suits them, they come together, they cooperate. It is only when it doesn't suit them that they tell you that this person is your enemy and you should go out and kill them. So yeah, it's interesting. At the higher levels of the hierarchy, you find very, very, very fruitful cooperation. Of course, I mean fruitful at a very personal level, parochial level for the leaders. But then the lower you come, and one of the problems where you have fiercer competition at the lower rungs of this group hierarchy is because the lower you go, the leaner resources become. The more scarcity you have, the more intense competition is, to the point that people disregard the risk of participating in violence. You have people that have lost their peers to violence. You have people that have been shot before. You have people that have lost, they still carry scars. But they are so desperate in this competition that they still go out again. And it's because of the intensity of competition, because resources are lean. For example, when campaign resources are being shared from the top, from the politician gives a certain amount to the campaign coordinator. Based on my ethnography of just this last elections of Nigeria in 2019, where I spent several months with this networks, this political network. So the politician gives an amount. It comes down to the campaign coordinators. The campaign coordinators take what they can take, and they work with, you have community leaders, religious leaders, clerics, they work with them. They give the cleric an amount, they say, well, talk to your people, take this. The cleric or the community leader takes it, keeps more than half for himself, find foot soldiers and give them. Okay, go and help and paste these posters. Go and help and convince your neighbors to vote for this man. The foot soldiers now have to compete. And then you have a large group of layabouts who are not even actually part of the formal political hierarchy, but they are just there waiting for any opportunity to become part of it. So these people compete within themselves to earn the confidence of the people above them so that they will be co-opted into this hierarchy. I don't know if that's clear.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kingsley, for a very stimulating talk and informative talk.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Next week, we have Gwenand Castar at the colloquium. And thank you all for participating, and thank you to Kingsley.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Kingsley.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.